You don't have to be living very long to know that disappointment is just a part of life. No matter how hard we try, no matter how hard we try to mitigate against it, we always experience these moments of disappointment. Last week, in episode 1 of our series, we talked about what it is that we do when people disappoint us, because people will disappoint us. And how grateful are we that we are not the ones that are in charge of deciding what happens to the people who disappoint us, because we also disappoint other people. And so last week what we said was that when people disappoint us, we can be grateful that God is the judge and not us, that God is the one who will handle the verdict, who will handle the judgment that comes down, who will make things better, make things right again. Because here's the thing, when you and I are the judge, what we want is a verdict that will make us feel better. But when God is the judge, when we let God be the judge, He delivers a judgment that makes the person better and eventually makes all of us better. So today, we're going to talk about what do we do if it's not people that are disappointing us? What if it is just life that disappoints us? A few years ago, there was a man named Neil Melly. Neil was down at LAX at the Los Angeles airport, and he wanted to fly back to Australia where he lived. Unfortunately, he couldn't find his credit card. All he had was a credit card receipt that had his number on it. So he went to the airport, went to the Australian Airlines counter and tried to purchase a ticket using his credit card receipt. Well, the ticketing agent was not going to take a credit card receipt with a credit card number on it. And no matter how hard Neil tried to explain that he had his card, that he couldn't find his card, the ticket agent would not give him a ticket or sell him a ticket to go home. He was frustrated, and most of us in that situation, we would just leave, but not Neil. He was so angry that he couldn't buy a ticket that he stripped off his clothes. I'm not sure exactly what he expected to gain from that, but that's what he did. He stripped off his clothes, jumped a fence that was lined with barbed wire on top, and then he ran across the tarmac at the airport. He saw an Australian Airlines jet, and so he ran to it, and then he crawled inside the wheel well of that plane. It was not smart at all. An airport spokeswoman named Nancy Castles said this. She said, "He could have been sucked up by an engine or crushed when the landing gear was retracted. And if not, he very likely would have frozen to death during the 15-and-a-half-hour flight at 30,000 feet while wearing no clothes." You know what the temperature is on the outside of the plane, on the part of the plane that's not comfortable where we normally sit? At 30,000 feet, it's about minus 48 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't see how Neil could have made it. But there he was, trying to get back to Australia in the wheel well of a plane. The pilots heard what happened. They stopped the plane. The police came. Neil wouldn't get out. Finally, the firemen came and they were able to coax him out. The official charge for Neil was trespassing. Needless to say, he never made it on the plane. Now, I'll bet that most of us, maybe all of us, have had moments when our plans didn't go as we expected. You know, our plans didn't go as planned, and we just lost our cool. Sure, we may not get as crazy as Neil, but we can get frustrated with people to the point that we do things that are just unreasonable. Maybe you had a plan for your career. You knew what you wanted to do. You knew where you wanted to do it. You knew what company you wanted to work for. You had it all planned out. But then life happens. And the company files bankruptcy, or maybe your kids came earlier than you expected them to come. Something in life happens, and all of a sudden you're working at a different company in a different job and wondering what happened to your plans. Maybe you had plans for your retirement. You worked hard, you saved hard, you calculated. You knew the exact day that was going to be your last day. And then the economy tanks, inflation hits, the market crashes, suddenly your 401k is only a 101k, and you realize that your last day is now 5 to 10 years farther out than you thought it was supposed to be. Or maybe you've been saving money to finally buy a house. You knew where you wanted to buy, you knew how much you needed to save, you even knew which house you wanted to get. And so you saved, and you skipped vacations, you ate rice and beans 3 nights a week. And when you finally had enough saved up, interest rates go from 2.5% to 7%, and now you can't afford the payments anymore. You know, one of the things that we've seen through this pandemic is that so many people's plans for their lives fell through. They had a good plan, but unexpected things happened and their plans fell through. Today you see people who are in line to get food, something that they thought that they would never have to do. In fact, the number of people who have been accessing food through the Second Harvest Food Bank has grown so much here in the Bay Area. It's one of the reasons why for our 2022 Christmas offering, we are trying to raise funds to resupply the Second Harvest Food Bank and to resource local distributors. Because we know that once this holiday season hits, and the holiday season is always so busy for the food bank, that when January comes, there are still going to be people that are hungry, that still need food. And so we want to make sure that we can do what we can to help resource the food bank so that they will have enough food. But also those families have children. And then another big part of our Christmas offering this year is for us to hire a full-time children's director so that we can have somebody here who is thinking all the time about how we can resource and encourage and help the children in our church and in our community. Because our plans disappoint us. And so what do we do when our plans disappoint us? What do we do when life doesn't turn out the way that we expected? In other words, what do we do when our plans disappoint us? Last week we read a manuscript that was written by a man named James. James was the brother of Jesus who didn't really believe that Jesus was who Jesus said he was until after Jesus had died and come back to life. James would later become the head of the church in Jerusalem. And then James would give us some insight into what to do when people disappoint us. And now he's going to talk about what do we do when our plans disappoint us. Listen to what he says. He says, "Look here, you who say today or tomorrow we are going to a certain town and we'll stay there a year. We will do business there and make a profit." You see, in this culture, it was very common for people who traded in goods to load up all of their goods and to travel by camel to different cities and to go to those cities and spend months, sometimes even over a year in that city selling their goods. They would go hang out there, make a profit, and then come home. And so they would go to cities all over Asia Minor, what we call today Turkey, all over the Middle East, and they would just hang out there, do what they needed to do, and come back. So what James was talking about is something that everybody understood. This is just what people did. It was a very common lifestyle. But listen to the certainty in the language that he is using. Right? The words that he chose were very specific. He says, we are going. We will do business. We will make a profit. In the Greek that this was originally written in, that word will is what they call, it's the tense of that verb is what they call future middle indicative. And all that means is that it is saying something about something in the future that is assured. Like we're talking about it today as if it's already done. And that is how James is saying people talk when they make plans. They talk about their plans as if it's a done deal, nothing's going to go wrong. What I say is what's going to happen. And James is saying, look at you guys. You're talking like all of this, all of your plans is in your hands. And it's not. You're talking like you have control over everything, and you don't. And so James says, listen to what he says. He says, how do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? How do you know? You don't even know what you're having for dinner tonight. How can you know what tomorrow is going to be like? How can you possibly know? This is Ricardo Lockett. He was a young man signed by the Seattle Seahawks. The first couple of years, he went around the league a little bit. He was signed to the Niners practice squad for a while, and then he was with the Bears. When finally he came back to the Seahawks, and he helped the Seahawks win the Super Bowl in 2014. But on November 1st, 2015, while playing the Cowboys in Dallas, Lockett was playing wide receiver and special teams, and I think it was on a punt return. He was just blindsided with a vicious hit, and he was laid out on the ground in front of 90,000 fans. He was carted off the field that day, and a year after the hit that broke his neck and nearly took his life, this is what Lockett had to say. He said, it's crazy what matters to you when you're in that situation. Cars, jewelry, big houses, Super Bowls, it all seems so meaningless. I came up from nothing, undrafted, practice squad, released a bunch of times. Then I made it to the Super Bowl. I have a saying, kind of like a mantra, $100 in a dream. I used to want a black Lamborghini in a 7-room house. That's what I dreamed about. Now, all of a sudden, I can't move. And the only thing that mattered to me in the entire world was being able to see my family again, to hold my kids in my arms. That's what he said. After surgery to repair his spine and then some really serious rehab, he began walking, and he was walking around just fine. In fact, he was even playing basketball again. But in May of the next year, he made the decision to retire from football at 29 years old. See, Lockett had made plans for his life. I mean, he was a standout, 6'2", 210. He could run the 40 in 4.3. He was only 29 years old. He had a Super Bowl ring. He had all these plans, all of these expectations for his life, and his plans disappointed him. His head coach at the time, Pete Carroll, used to preach this to all of his players. He would say, you live in a temporary fairy tale. Your fans are temporary, your coaches are temporary, your teammates, as much as they love you, are temporary. The big houses you live in are temporary. You can enjoy all that stuff, but it's not what will bring you happiness. See, Pete Carroll was preaching to his players the same thing that James is trying to tell us when he says, how do you know what your life will be like tomorrow? How do you know? None of us do. And while it's important for us to have plans, if we make our plans on our own with everything that we do based on what we can do and based on an assumption that everything is within our control, always. And James says there's something that's more important than that. He's saying that we have to look at the big picture, that we can't keep our eyes focused just on me, what I want, how I wanted it to be. Listen to what he writes next. He says, your life is like the morning fog. It's here a little while, then it's gone. Now, I don't know about where you are if you're watching us online, but for those of us who are here today live, who live here in the Bay Area, that line hits us a little different, right? Because when he says life is like the morning fog, and we think, well, what do you mean? It's going to be around all day, right? It's going to be around forever. We can't seem to get out of it. No, that's not what he's talking about, right? It's a little bit different for us here. That the fog comes out. And you look around and you go, whoa, there's the fog. Sometimes it's even pretty the way the fog lays. And then before you know it, you're going throughout your day and you don't even realize, you look around and the fog is gone. Before we know it, it's gone. And James is reminding us that life goes by so unbelievably fast. It goes by so fast. Coleman Mockler was the former CEO of Gillette. Yeah, the razor company. And today, he is still celebrated around the world in the business world as one of the most effective CEOs of all time. He graduated from Harvard Business School with an MBA, and then he went to work for the Gillette Corporation, and he just steadily moved up, working real hard. He moved up the ladder until one day he became CEO. Forbes magazine had just put him on the cover of their next issue. The issue hadn't yet come out, but the issue was to celebrate his leadership and his success. And then on January 25th in 1991, Forbes magazine sent him a copy, an advance copy of that edition of the magazine where he was going to be on the cover. They wanted him to take a look at it before it went out into final publication. Applauding him as he walked through the office, carrying the magazine where he was on the cover. In so many ways, it was an amazing day for Coleman. But there was one thing that made that day not just unexpectedly amazing, but also unexpectedly tragic. Because as he was walking towards his office with the staff applauding, he walked into his office, he closed the door, and as soon as he closed the door, he crumpled to the ground. Within moments of walking through that door, Coleman was dead. He had died of a massive heart attack, and when they found him, he was still laying on the floor, holding on to that Forbes magazine with his face on the cover. Actually, his whole body on the cover. James isn't saying that we shouldn't make plans, right? He isn't saying that we shouldn't get out there and that we shouldn't do stuff. He's saying there's another element that you need to include in your planning and in your doing. Listen to what he writes, right? Instead of saying, I'm going to do this, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. He says what you ought to say is, if the Lord wants us to, we will live and do this or that. Now that word wants doesn't mean orders. Like, I want a pizza, so I'm going to order a pizza. I want you to clean your room, so I'm going to order you to clean your room. That's not what it means. It means more like decree. Everything that God has for us in our lives, what we want to do is we want to move with what God has already set in motion instead of trying to move against it. He's not saying that all our plans have to be about God. Right? Your plans don't have to be, well, this is how eventually I'm going to be a pastor, or this is how I'm going to be a missionary in China. Right? That's not what he's saying. Is that our planning should always include God. Because here's the thing. When we include God in our planning, we give Him permission to move through our plans. When we include God in the process of planning out our lives, planning out where we want to go, we are giving Him permission to smooth out the edges, to make little nudges, to lead us into the adjustments that we have to make so that we can accomplish that plan. And we can be confident that even when things that come up that seem to disappoint us, when things come up that seem to change our plans, that God is still in it and He's still moving. One of my favorite verses is a line that was written by the Apostle Paul, who wrote this in a letter that he wrote to the church in Rome. We're confident, we know, that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose for them. See, no matter what happens, no matter what we may see, no matter how disappointed we may feel, we can have the confidence of knowing that God is still moving the pieces around. That God is still working things and weaving things together for your good and for my good. But when our plans change, it doesn't mean that our plans failed. It just means we have to make adjustments. The world gets this, and when we're in the world, we get this. When market conditions change, we give Him permission to change our plans. James says otherwise. In other words, if you don't your planning, you are boasting about your own pretentious plans. When you make plans, saying, I can do whatever I want, what God wants doesn't matter. And you think that you have more power than God does? And he says, when you think like that, man, like bad. But that word evil is actually unwise. James is saying that when based on our own wisdom, our own intelligence, when we do that, the odds are against us. The odds are against us to succeed. And when we it's unwise, it's unsound. There was a special report by Ira Glass where he followed the lives of several people who are currently Plan B for their lives. Ira got a group of 100 people to think back to the beginning of their adulthood, to think back to when they were just starting to think about the plans for their life. What is it that they wanted to do, where they thought their life was going to go, where they would go, their plan for their life. He called that Plan A. He called it the fate you were sure fate had in store. And then he asked those who were still following, he got those 100 people together and he said, for those who are still following Plan A, raise your hand. And only one person in the entire room said that she was still on Plan A. Of course, she was the youngest person there. She was only 23 years old. Long enough, you realize that no matter how well you plan, unforeseen things that can come up. There's so many unexpected things that will come up. Now it's going to require us to make adjustments, change our plans. And if we put our faith and our trust in our plans, then we will always be disappointed. Well, when our plans disappoint us, we can be grateful that God is our King, that He is the one that rules, that He not only has the authority but the power to rule in our lives, that He sees the things that you and I can't see, and that He can use our disappointed plans and turn them into something good. This is how Jesus would say it. Jesus said, look at the lilies of they don't work or make clothing. Yet Solomon in all his wonderfully as they are. Wonderfully for wildflowers that are here today and thrown into the fire tomorrow, He will certainly care for you. Why do you have so little faith? So these verse. But your heavenly Father already knows all your needs. And like a good and perfect Father, a good and perfect heavenly Father, because He knows all of my needs and all of your needs, that He is going to weave things together for our good. In the midst of our plans changing, in the midst of our plans being adjusted, our plans have failed. Can trust that God is weaving things together for our good. We can be grateful that God is our King.
Thank you for joining us for this week's message. Gracepoint Church is located in South San Francisco, California. For additional content or to find out more information about Gracepoint Church, visit us online at wearegracepoint.com.